The clouds had gathered for days, thick and heavy like burdens the sky could no longer hold. In the small village of Araba, nestled between rolling hills and ancient trees, the people watched the darkening horizon with growing dread. They had seen storms before. The rainy season always came with thunder and wind, but never had the air felt so heavy, so angry. Adéjoke stood at the doorway of her modest home, her youngest son clinging to her waist, her other two children huddled nearby. Her husband, Kola, had been gone for many months, working in a distant city to send money back to the family. Alone, she had kept the house standing, the fields planted, and the children fed. But as the first drops of rain struck the dry earth with violent force, Adéjoke felt a fear she had never known settle deep in her bones. The storm came not with warning but with a roar, ripping through the village like a wild animal. Roofs were torn away like paper. Trees, some older than the memory of any living soul, cracked and fell with a sound that shook the very ground. The wind howled through the streets, lifting belongings into the sky as if mocking the humans who dared build homes on sacred earth. Inside the fragile walls of her home, Adéjoke clutched her children close, whispering prayers under her breath. She called out not to the gods of the city, but to the spirits her mother had taught her to honor, to Oya, mother of winds, lady of change, guardian of thresholds. "Protect my children," she whispered, over and over, as the walls shuddered and the roof threatened to give way. "Guide us through this storm. Give me strength." When morning finally broke, it did so with a painful silence. The village of Araba lay in ruins. The fields were flooded, the roads washed away, and the homes, including Adéjoke's, reduced to broken walls and scattered memories. For a long time she simply sat among the wreckage, her children asleep against her body, too exhausted even to cry. Neighbors moved like ghosts among the ruins, salvaging what they could, mourning what was lost. Adéjoke had nothing left but her children and the clothes on their backs. She could have despaired. Many did. Some spoke of leaving, of seeking better fortune in distant towns. Some gave in to anger, to hopelessness. But Adéjoke, even as grief gnawed at her heart, remembered the stories of Oya, the fierce Oriksha who did not fear change, who rode the storms and transformed destruction into renewal. It was an old lesson her grandmother had taught her by the fire. When Oya blows through your life, child, she is not there to punish you. She is there to sweep away what is dead so that new life can grow. But you must have the courage to plant again. Those words echoed in Adéjoke's heart as she stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. Her body ached, her spirit trembled, but she knew what she had to do. First, she gathered the villagers, those who still had breath and strength enough to listen. She spoke not with the authority of a chief or a priestess, but with the voice of a mother who had no choice but to fight for tomorrow. "We have lost much," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that burned behind her eyes. "But we are still here. Our ancestors faced worse, and they stood. We must stand too, not just for ourselves, but for our children and for the land that has never abandoned us." At first, there was only silence. Faces, weary and broken, looked back at her. But then an old man, Baba Sion, placed his hand on her shoulder and nodded. Others followed, hesitant, uncertain but willing to try. They began with what little they had. They cleared the debris. They salvaged wood, stones, anything that could be used again. They built shelters from fallen branches and mud bricks. Women prepared simple meals from whatever was left in the storerooms. The elders told stories by the fire at night, keeping the spirit of the village alive even as the world around them seemed to crumble. Adéjoke worked harder than she ever had in her life. Every blister on her hands, every sore muscle, was an offering to the future she refused to surrender. She taught her children to find joy even in small things. a ripe mango found floating down a flooded path, a bird singing after the rain, the warmth of a shared meal, and always, in her heart, she whispered to Oya, not asking for miracles but giving thanks for the strength to keep going. Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, Araba began to live again. New huts rose where the old ones had fallen. Green shoots pushed up through the cracked earth. Babies were born, songs were sung, laughter returned to the air. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold, Adéjoke stood at the edge of the village and looked out over the fields. She was covered in dust, her clothes were patched and worn, but her heart was full. Her oldest son came to stand beside her. "Mama," he said softly, "how did you know we would survive?" She smiled, brushing a hand through his tangled hair. "I didn't know," she said, "but I believed. Our ancestors have survived every storm. I had to trust that we would too." He nodded, thinking deeply as children do, and together they watched the stars appear one by one over the land that still breathed with life. And somewhere, high above where the winds still whispered through the trees, Oya smiled. As the seasons shifted and the rains returned with gentler hands, Araba grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. The villagers built new homes, sturdier than before, homes that hugged the earth and leaned into the wisdom of generations past. They planted new crops, choosing varieties their ancestors once favored, the ones known to endure both drought and flood. Adéjoke found herself at the heart of this quiet rebirth. Not because she sought it, but because resilience has a way of drawing others near. The women came to her for advice on raising gardens and children. The men sought her counsel on rebuilding walls and repairing the damaged irrigation channels that fed the fields. Even the elders, who had once watched her with pity as a young widow struggling alone, now spoke her name with respect. Yet Adéjoke never claimed credit for herself. Whenever someone thanked her, she would simply smile and say, "It was not me alone. The river flows because it follows its course. I only listened to the wind and walked where it led me." Still, she knew the truth buried in her heart. Without her stubborn faith, without the fierce spirit that refused to break, Araba might have been abandoned to ruin. One evening, as preparations were underway for the Yam Festival, a celebration long delayed by hardship, Adéjoke sat with the other women weaving decorations from palm fronds. The village square buzzed with life, children rehearsing dances, drummers testing rhythms, the smell of roasting yams and spices thick in the air. Mama Teni, one of the oldest women in Araba, leaned over and touched Adéjoke's arm with a hand as soft and weathered as old cloth. "You remind me of Oya herself," Mama Teni said, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades. "The wind comes, the storm rages, and when it passes, only those who know how to bend and rise again still stand." Adéjoke chuckled softly, embarrassed. "I am just a mother who refused to let her children go hungry," she said. But Mama Teni shook her head slowly. "It's more than that, child. You carried not just your own family through the storm, but all of us." Adéjoke let the words settle in her heart. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, often overwhelmed. But maybe, just maybe, courage wasn't about feeling powerful. Maybe it was about standing up one more time, even when your knees shook and your heart whispered that you couldn't. That night, as the festival fires were lit and the drums called out to the stars, Adéjoke led her children through the dance circles. She wore a simple white cloth tied at her waist, a string of cowrie shells in her hair. Her youngest son clung to her hand, laughing as he stumbled through the steps. The people of Araba danced too, old and young, scarred and whole, their bodies moving in rhythm with the heartbeat of the earth. They sang praises not only to the Orishas, but to the strength within themselves, to the ancestors who had endured and the descendants who would carry their stories forward. At the edge of the square stood a newly carved shrine, humble but beautiful. It honored Oya, not with grand statues, but with a simple stone, smoothed by the river and crowned with a wreath of braided grasses. It was a reminder that from the wildness of storms, from the shaking of foundations, new life could always be born. Adéjoke approached the shrine quietly, her children at her side. She knelt before it, placing a small offering of millet and honey, the simplest gifts, yet the richest she could give. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for the strength to weather the storm. Thank you for the courage to begin again." The wind stirred around her, lifting the edge of her cloth, caressing her face with a touch as soft as a mother's blessing. Adéjoke smiled, knowing it was not magic that saved them, nor miracles born of thin air. It was faith and action and the unbreakable bond between earth, spirit, and human heart. As the festival roared on behind her, Adéjoke stood tall, her children's hands in hers, and faced the future without fear. The storm had tested her. The storm had broken her home, but it had also unearthed a strength she never knew she possessed. And like the strongest stones, she had not shattered, she had only been shaped.